Charlie McGee is back in this 2022 feature-length film remake of Firestarter. The movie looks good from a cinematic standpoint. The acting isn't terrible, and the special effects aren't the worst. I mean, the score was done by John freaking Carpenter, but it seems the moral messaging and the overall emotional experience left much to be desired for the majority of viewers, myself included. Hi there, I'm your host, Mr. Doyle, and this is a great undertaking. First of all, I'm back after a brief hiatus. Last week I tested positive for COVID and was incapacitated for a few days and spent most of the last week living outside so as to not infect my family. Thank you to everyone who sent well wishes and good vibes my way. The worst parts of the experience only lasted a few days, and I've made a full recovery. Fortunately, my bout with COVID was mild compared to what it could have been, so I am grateful for that. But while I was in quarantine, the new Firestarter remake dropped, and along with it were the innumerable reviews by folks like myself trying to cash in on the relevant content algorithm. I had originally planned to put out my Skeleton Crew ranking last week, but I'm already a week behind on the Firestarter hype train, so Skeleton Crew ranking is coming next Saturday. Anyway, having already covered the novel, the first film adaptation, and the two-part TV miniseries sequel, Firestarter 2 Rekindled, in this channel's Firestarter series back in 2021, I of course wanted to cover this new movie as well. So I watched the Firestarter remake, and I also watched just about every YouTube review I came across to see what my fellow King fans and horror aficionados were saying. And while I agreed with most of their comments, which were practically unanimous, I felt that the majority of their criticisms were missing what I felt was the biggest issue the film suffered from. I'll do my best to keep this video as spoiler-free as possible for anyone who has yet to see the movie. However, I consider any relevant plot points from the book to be fair game. If you're into Stephen King and the never-ending treasure trove of content King has inspired over the years, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. Thanks. History and background. This movie just dropped on Friday, May 13th, both in theaters and simultaneously on the streaming service Peacock. The story is, of course, based on the 1980 novel by Stephen King and is the second screen adaptation of the story, the first of which was released in 1984. The Firestarter remake was produced by Blumhouse and a handful of other lesser-known production companies. And if there's one thing horror fans know about Blumhouse, it's that they churn out a ton of films with varying degrees of success and quality, so the Blumhouse name is more synonymous with inconsistency than it is with reliability. But they have given us a handful of gems like the two groundbreaking, genre-defying Jordan Peele films Get Out and Us, the decidedly not-so-scary but still fantastic Spike Lee joint Black Klansman, and depending on how you feel about them, the Paranormal Activity and Insidious franchises. So, while their track record may be spotty, they've got some reputable titles under their umbrella. The remake is directed by Keith Thomas, who is best known for, and as it turns out, only known for his 2019 directorial debut, The Vigil, which has garnered a reasonable level of critical acclaim. The screenplay was written by Scott Teems, who prior to Firestarter most recently wrote the screenplay for Halloween Kills. The soundtrack was composed and performed by Dan Davies, who is the son of Dave Davies of the Kinks, legendary director and composer John Carpenter, and his son Cody Carpenter. John Carpenter was originally supposed to direct the original Firestarter film back in the day, so, that didn't come to fruition. And so it's kind of cool that he ended up working on this remake in some capacity. It seems both the Carpenters and Davies have developed a working relationship with Blumhouse over the years, with the trio also scoring the two most recent Halloween movies for Blumhouse. Which is also kind of cool since, of course, John Carpenter wrote and directed the OG 1978 Halloween film. Cast and acting. The primary cast includes young actress Ryan Kiera Armstrong as Charlie McGee, whose acting credits include roles on American Horror Story, Black Widow, and the It movie remake. Ryan does a decent enough job in the role, easily outshining Drew Barrymore's 1984 portrayal, in my opinion. She can be sweet and unassuming, but she can pull off dark and brooding as well. We also have Sydney Lemon as Vicky McGee, best known for her role in the Hulu show Hellstrom. I wasn't blown away by her performance, but she doesn't get a lot of screen time either, so maybe I just needed more from her. Other noteworthy actors include Kurtwood Smith, or as most know him, Red Foreman. He only makes a brief appearance as Dr. Wanless, and Michael Grey Eyes, who plays John Rainbird, who has also acted on shows Fear the Walking Dead and American Gods. I felt that Grey Eyes' performance was pretty flat and emotionless, honestly. But his screen time totaled maybe 5 to 10 minutes, so he didn't exactly have an opportunity to deliver a more dynamic performance. And of course, absolute Giga Chad Zac Efron plays Andy McGee. Efron is best known for being a chiseled heartthrob stud muffin. Look, I didn't know I had a man crush on Zac Efron prior to watching this movie. It just kind of happened, okay? He's a beautiful man, and his acting, he performs admirably. And that man's bod and that scruffy beard, geez, Zach, save some sex appeal for the rest of us. Anyway, I feel that perhaps had his performance been bad, I may not have noticed, as I was clearly distracted. But I'm pretty sure his performance was, at worst, just all right, and at best, not terrible. However, plenty of critics seem to think Efron was just bad. Critical reception. I'm writing this segment the day after the film's release, and already the Wikipedia article states that the film, quote, received negative reviews from critics, unquote. So, yeah, that was quick. And yeah, it seems that a great many YouTube critics were bursting at the seams to dunk on this movie. I watched a dozen reviews for Firestarter, one of which was mostly positive, and the rest of which ranged from utterly unimpressed to deeply disappointed. So I'm going to spend the rest of this video discussing the major criticisms that are almost universally agreed upon, whether or not I agree with them, and then address the biggest issue I had with the movie that I didn't really see anyone else talking about. Recurring criticisms included the film being too dark, and not in a tone or vibe sort of way, but literally that it was too dark to make out what was happening. I didn't personally have this issue, though perhaps it was a specific viewing format or medium that was causing this. Another common gripe was that it felt more like a superhero movie than a horror film. And I see what they mean, but it played like a supervillain origin story, though, not a superhero story. I mean, this version of Charlie is overtly evil. She says some horribly cold-blooded shit to her dad, completely scorches a poor animal, and seemingly feels nothing. She's raised to suppress and hide who she really is. She wants to light up a kid at school just for calling her weird, which is just a bit of an overreaction, and the only emotion she ever really sells is rage. But especially with the way the movie ended, which was vastly different from the book and original movie, this movie was 100% a supervillain origin story. Also, the way this movie ended was an obvious effort to allow for the possibility of a sequel, which, based on this movie's performance, isn't likely to happen. Everyone seemed to agree that the score was the best part of the movie, and it was well composed and performed, but it just didn't fit the vibe of the movie for me. It's got that classic John Carpenter score appeal, and, that's cool, but the rest of the movie doesn't. So the experience is exactly what you'd imagine. Firestarter is a movie made in the 2020s and set in the 2020s, but with a 1980s soundtrack. Those synth-heavy 80s horror vibes just felt wildly out of place. Again, not saying the soundtrack was bad, it was just not right for this movie. Also, there were some wholly understandable criticisms of the dialogue. Most of the time it's played straight and there is no campy, silly stuff, but for some reason they throw some bafflingly out-of-place one-liners in there. For what reason, I don't know. For anyone who saw the movie or even just the trailer, Charlie uses the line, "Liar, liar, pants on fire," right before setting somebody ablaze, and while that isn't the only dumb as hell line from the movie, it is a standout for all the wrong reasons and is just inexcusable. And finally, for the last shared critical gripe, in the book and first film, there are two massive battles when Charlie and Andy make a stand, and this movie just forgoes those scenes or changes them so drastically that the impact is lost entirely. The most action-packed fire and fury moments from the original story are set up and then doused in lukewarm, unsatisfactory subversions. I mean, I understand wanting to throw some surprise twists in to keep the viewer on their toes, and this movie does that in numerous ways with varying degrees of effectiveness, but when that means nixing the most action-packed parts of the story, I just felt cheated, honestly. As far as the special effects go, most reviewers seem to think that they were pretty good and that the gorier moments were well executed. I agree for the most part, but there was this one scene in particular where Charlie is being advanced on by a group of dudes in fireproof suits, and she blasts them with everything she's got, but the way the scene was shot, you never see Charlie blasting the guys. Instead, we get a first-person perspective from Charlie's view that is just very obviously a flamethrower positioned under the camera that is being used to light up this group of would-be captors. I assume the budget didn't allow for any CGI trickery, so while I applaud their efforts, they didn't try very hard to sell this particular scene. Alright, so for me, the biggest issue with this movie was, and I'm not sure how this isn't everyone's biggest issue with it, when Vicky, mother of Charlie and wife to Andy, dies, the grieving process is over immediately. Charlie and Andy speed away from the scene, having just discovered that the most important woman in their lives is dead, a wife and mother for at least 11 years, and by the next morning it's as if it never happened. Andy wakes up and there's not even a moment of realization or a teary-eyed sob, just no acknowledgement of the horrific tragedy that has completely devastated their lives. Obviously, this isn't something you just move on from or get over after a good night's sleep. It was an opportunity to further establish the grievous injustices that were committed upon Andy and Charlie. They should have been absolutely distraught, but instead they're only on the run, trying to salvage their own lives without sparing a thought to the fact that their lives were irreparably damaged. Of all the missteps the original Firestarter movie may have made, they got this part right. The loss of Vicky, the beloved wife and loving mother, felt huge and horrible. It weighed on our protagonists for the duration of the film. It's an afterthought here in this version, and that's just the most unrealistic part of this entire movie, in my opinion. When I put myself and my daughter in the shoes of Andy and Charlie, I get choked up just thinking about the loss of my wife. The absolute shock of dismay and deep, undefinable sense of loss, of absolute devastation, overwhelms me. The days, weeks, and months, the years that follow would be of regular, if not constant, mourning. These two should be inconsolable, at least for a little while. For just one scene, at least one scene, we should see them bereft in utter fucking shambles, destroyed by heartache and despair, but no. Their only concern is self-preservation. They don't radiate sadness or reflect on what has happened with the weight that it deserves, and in all honesty, that is far more far-fetched to me than a pyrokinetic murder child. Final thoughts. Blumhouse proves yet again that they are reliably unreliable with this, the most meh of King movie remakes. It could have been worse, absolutely yes, but will I ever desire to watch it again? Absolutely not. As I mentioned in my previous video for the Christine movie adaptation, Blumhouse has secured the rights to remake Christine, and I was apprehensive at best back then, so any hope I held onto that they wouldn't totally screw up Christine, what is perhaps my all-time favorite King movie, has, forgive the pun, gone up in flames. In next week's video, I'll finally be ranking all of the stories from the Skeleton Crew collection, which turns out to have just as many misses as it does hits for me. New videos drop on this channel every Saturday at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, so please subscribe to the channel to get notifications for each video. Okay, goodbye. Be sure to click like and subscribe to the channel for my continued analysis of all things Stephen King, pretty pleased with blood and guts on top. My name is Mr. Doyle, and this has been a great undertaking.